Well, thank you very much indeed, Bishop Alden. It's always good to hear these things, even if you know they're not true. The other difficulty, of course, with being introduced by friends is the danger of them saying something that they know, but that you should not know. But Alden has done very well in not saying those things, so thank you again for that. The scene has been so well set for us by our speakers so far. The question has been one of mission. We had imagined that this conference would be, first of all, about mission, but we have been so enriched by what our speakers have said also about the history. And these two hang together, as I hope we shall see. Bishop Richard, I think it was, who was saying that Anglicanism after the Reformation was slow off the mark as far as mission is concerned. And this is true to some extent, but it is certainly a perception. To bring an unlikely witness to bear testimony on this, the United Kingdom Border Agency, which is the equivalent of your what do you call it? The homeland and yes, it's a very long word, isn't it? Title, isn't it? But anyway, the United Kingdom Border Agency has a policy of giving refuge to evangelical Christians who flee Iran, on the grounds that if they were sent back to Iran, they would suffer persecution. But they don't do this for Anglican Christians because they say Anglican Christians don't bear witness to their faith. Now, is this true? I mean, this is a very serious charge indeed, from an unlikely source, of course, but nevertheless serious. And is the charge of amnesia, therefore, as far as mission is concerned, true or not? So what I'm going to do this afternoon is to remind you of certain things. You will know about them already, but then for us together to draw out the implications, or some of the implications, of that reminder. That's why it's amnesia and anamnesis, and I think it should be both, because if we only concentrated on the amnesia, we'd get very depressed, and as Bishop Richard was saying, that is not desirable for Anglicans, especially in our current circumstances, to get depressed. Anamnesis is an important word. It's an important biblical word, first of all, central to our thinking, remembering God, remembering what He has done for us, reminding Him of what He has done for us, and of course, remembering also what He has called us to be. If we begin at the beginning, Bishop Richard was saying that his diocese was reorganized in 604. My former diocese was only founded in 604, so there we are. But we find at that time the sort of very origins of what came to be Anglicanism, two prongs of mission, as it were, working almost at the same time in the British Islands. So from the north, the Celtic mission was spreading southwards, and we have people like Aidan and his disciples Chad and Ced spreading the faith in the Celtic way, if you like, down as far south as Lichfield, and it may have been further south than that, for all I know. But of course, the Roman mission of Augustine and his companions had also arrived, and they were also spreading the faith on both sides of the River Thames, I'm glad to say, and also up the east coast, up to Northumbria. Of course, there were tensions between these two groups as the faith was spread, tensions which had to be resolved. But there were certain features about them that we need to note, because I think they are important for us today. So the Celtic mission was always, I think, characterized by peregrinus, by the tendency to roam. Well, I mean, ever since I stopped being a diocesan bishop, I've been roaming quite a lot. But I've not regarded it as a virtue. However, the Celts did. I mean, a pilgrimage was in itself a Christian calling. And as people roamed in the cause of God, they brought people to faith, they established churches, and so on. And I suppose what you can say about the Celtic way in this context is that it was remarkably flexible. Unpredictable may even be a better word. No one quite knew what would happen. I mean, they all trusted in God, but the results of this wandering were not always set out beforehand. So they trusted in God in what would happen as a result of their wanderings. On the other hand, the Roman mission of Augustine and his companions, of course they were spreading the faith and planting churches, but they were also interested in creating institutions and structure. And in this, it's actually the people who immediately followed Theodore of Tarsus from the continent of Asia, if that's important, Archbishop of Canterbury, and the man who came with him. Actually, the Pope had wanted Hadrian the African to be the Archbishop, but he was very shy and didn't want to be. And so he said, well, make Theodore the Archbishop, but I'll go with him and help him in his mission. And between them, they actually created the structures that we now take for granted. And indeed, many of the institutions, the parochial system, with its commitment to Christian presence in every community, for example, a commitment to universal education. I was noting how John McArdle was talking about education in this part of the world by the Anglican Church. But all of this goes back a very long way to Theodore and Hadrian. So this mission ad intra, as it were, the two aspects of it, which I believe to be complementary, on the one hand, flexibility and movement, on the other hand, the creating of structure and institution in the name of the Lord. But of course, in this period, Britain was also known for sending missionaries. The Celts sent them. I mean, peregrinus did not end within the islands. Many of them went across to the continent and evangelized there. Columbanus comes to mind as a very active Celtic evangelist in France and northern Italy. But those who had been evangelized by the mission of Augustine also became missionaries to Europe, and very seriously so. If I take the names of Wilfrid and Willibrord and Boniface, the difference that these people made to what was to become the Christian history of Europe, now so sadly neglected by Europe, is quite amazing indeed. Boniface, the apostle to the Germans in many ways, but also, I suppose, the single name, if you had to name someone, who was responsible for the emergence of a Christian Northern Europe. I mean, this is a vast claim to make on behalf of someone, but I think possibly justified as far as he is concerned. Now again, there was a tension in the methods employed by the missionaries. This is a generalization, if you like, but the Celts, it seems to me anyway, were more accommodating of culture. They were ready from their own past, as it were, to Christianize previous practices, for example. the debate about the tonsure, I mean, we regard it as a somewhat esoteric debate, but the debate really was whether they had adopted a practice from the pagan past and whether the Roman practice was therefore purer as far as Christian faith was concerned. On the other hand, missionaries like Boniface and Willibrord took the line of Christ being against culture, and the felling of the great oak of Donar, which Boniface carried out, spelled the end really of paganism in that part of Europe. Of course, everyone thought that if he cut down the sacred tree, he would immediately die, be killed. And when nothing happened to him, then of course they acknowledged that Christ was after all superior to Donar. And everything else flowed from that. This activity in mission from England to Europe continued for many centuries. The evangelization of Scandinavia, for instance. Olav, king of the Norwegians, became a Christian in Britain. And so rather like Gregory the Illuminator and the Arminians, he was baptized in Britain and then went back to his own people and evangelized them. And what an amazing story that has been. So all of this, we can say, continued to the 12th, 13th century. We then have a gap. The Crusades happened. The Franciscans and the Dominicans developed a peaceful approach to Islam. That is not my subject today, but it is a fascinating subject if you ever want to hear about it. But then we have what has euphemistically been called the 16th century emergency. There were things at the time of the Reformation that were conducive to mission. Bishop Richard has pointed out already the commitment to translatability that is to be found in the fundamental documents of Anglicanism. He was mentioning the preface to the Book of Common Prayer and the article on ceremonies. We may also, of course, mention the articles of religion here. That is to say, the commitment that people should worship in their own language, according to their own idiom, in their own way, and that there is no one kind of pattern that everyone throughout the world, regardless of national or cultural origin, must use. This commitment to translatability, how Aramaic became Greek, we were hearing last night, is part of the nature of the gospel itself. That the gospel takes root in people's cultures, in their mindset, in their values, their idiom, their customs, their worldview, and so forth. And I mention this because it seems obvious to me that Islam is not like that. I mean, Islam is also a worldwide faith, but there is a kind of residual, vestigial Arabicness about Islam that can never be translated. Well, the gospel is not like that. And there was a recognition, therefore, even at the time of this emergency and in the years that were to follow, of the nature of the gospel and of its translatability by the reformers. Secondly, there were people like Adrian Saravia, who, by the way, was a Dutchman, and came to England because he became convinced that episcopacy was the best structure for mission. Well, I don't know what we think now after 300 or 400 years, but Saravia certainly did enough to leave his homeland, to come to England, becoming Dean of Westminster eventually, and in one of his sermons, he points out that the Lord's promise to remain with his church forever is contingent upon the church being missionary in Matthew 28. So the Great Commission and the dominical presence of the Lord in the church belong together. And we cannot continue to hope for that presence with us if we have forgotten about our mission. However, it is true to say, in spite of these lights, as it were, at the time, that the Reformation did not result in a sense of the worldwide obligation of the church for mission. The Reformation as a whole, and that includes the Anglican Reformation. And the question, of course, is why? Why was this? Again, as has been said, the Counter-Reformation resulted in vigorous missionary activity. I've just been to Peru, and the signs of that missionary activity are all around. The vigorous missionary activity was not always enlightened. Bishop Stephen Neal, eminent historian of Christian mission, tells us that given the cruelty of the Spanish and the Portuguese in Latin America, he was surprised there was anyone who was Christian there at all. But under God, there were other people who resisted the ravages of those who had conquered that continent and who stood up for the rights of the indigenous people there. Bishop Bartolome Las Casas, for instance, comes to mind, and his use of the language of human dignity and of human rights came to influence the Enlightenment in Europe. So why did the Reformation not result in a sense and a responsibility for world mission? The reasons that have been given by historians like Warnick include the following. There is the geographical, first of all. The claim is made that the sea routes were controlled by the Spanish and the Portuguese at the time, and so the churches and the countries of the Reformation had no access, as it were, to engage in world mission. Before the Spanish and the Portuguese, the sea routes had been controlled by the Muslim Arab navies, of course. There is something in that. Another reason that is given is political, that the Reformation was so tied up with the history of a particular people and of maybe even a political system, that the reformers struggling for survival simply did not have that vision of going beyond a particular people and a particular system. But of course, the third reason is a theological one, which was that of a certain kind of dispensationalism. That the apostles had been given the Holy Spirit to preach the gospel to the whole world. Those nations that accepted the apostolic preaching, well, that was wonderful. They were predestined to salvation. Those who did not, well, it's hard luck. But it had nothing to do with us. God was sovereign, and if he wished still to bring these people to the fulfillment of his purposes for them, he would do so. Full stop. Now, this kind of amnesia about world mission began to be challenged, and I was so glad that Jonathan Edwards' name was mentioned because it was his teaching on the use of means by God to fulfill his purposes that became so important for the recovery of a sense of world mission. And I'm also so glad that Bishop Compton's work and the name of Thomas Bray has already been mentioned, the establishing of the Society for the Promoting of the Christian Faith and of the Propagation of the Gospel, the SPCK and the SPG as they came to be called. Let's begin by asking, if the Reformers did not have a sense of world mission, how is there an Anglican communion today? I mean, that's the question. And it seems to me that there are three main ways in which the Anglican communion arose, or the churches of the Anglican communion arose. You have heard about some of this already, but just to recapitulate very quickly, the first is what I call the coincidental spread of Anglicanism. That is to say, it spread along with the spread of English-speaking people throughout the world. And South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia are obvious examples of how this happened, that the church came with those who came to live here. Even after the establishment of these societies, the main thrust of the church's work was with those who had come from England and had settled here, and their descendants. Of course, there were people who looked beyond that. Already the 1662 Book of Common Prayer provides for adult baptism on the grounds that this was necessary because of Anabaptism, and also it may be useful, as it says, for certain natives in our plantations. Well, there were some such, though Stephen Neal tells us that in the 17th century, according to the records, only one Indian, that is to say Indian in India, was baptized according to Anglican rites. Only one. Now, this coincidental spread of Anglicanism obviously has a very strong organic relation to the English church, and we have heard both last night and today how that works out. It could work out for good or for ill. The emphasis both last night and this morning has been on the missionary aspect of that relationship and not simply a feeling of nostalgia. I think it would be very sad if the link was only nostalgic. The second way, then, in which Anglicanism spread is what you might call properly evangelical. And this has to do with the evangelical revival, with the recovery of a doctrine of means, as I have said, that God uses means to fulfill his purposes, and we may be the means by which he fulfills those purposes. We may be the means. So there's a personal challenge involved here. And it is interesting that the very people like Wilberforce, later on Shaftesbury, but along with Wilberforce, the Clapham sect, who were working for the conversion of people in England, who were working for the transformation of society, for the introduction of universal education, the revival of nursing as a noble profession, and so on. It's these very people who also had a vision for the worldwide mission of the church. And their vision had very much to do with what you might call the voluntary principle. That is to say, not to depend on the state or on the institutions even of the church, but on personal and corporate responsibility to further this mission. So when the Church Missionary Society, of which I was General Secretary for some years, was established, they wanted to be churchmen. They were quite clear about that. Nevertheless, the initiative was theirs. They wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury for permission to begin their work. It took him 2 years to reply to their letter. It's nothing new under the sun. But they were convinced under God that this was their calling. and so many parts of the Anglican communion owe their existence to the commitment of these people, those who formed the CMS and societies after that, to go out with the gospel. In fact, we may say of these evangelical missionaries that their work was characterized by their commitment. So when the CMS missionaries went to West Africa, to Nigeria, for instance, they sometimes took their coffins with them because they knew they were not returning. This is long-term incarnational mission, commitment to the people and to Christ, in whose name they were going. We criticize Victorian missionaries for their paternalism and authoritarianism and all of that, and some of that's justified. But I think we've also got to look at the other side. There was also a commitment to the crossing of cultures, to the learning of the language, the customs and the beliefs of the people, the translating of the Bible, sometimes in the process creating the modern form of the language in so many parts of the world. My own mother tongue, Urdu, was spoken by people as a kind of compromise between the Persian rulers and civil servants, their civil servants, and the common people. It was the British who gave it the form of a literary language. After that, it produced a great literature. And this story can be repeated in so many different ways. A commitment to the crossing of cultures. So much that we know about other religions. We know about those things because of these early missionaries, people like William Carey, for instance, Henry Martin, whose anniversary we are celebrating this year, and so many others. And then thirdly, they were not afraid to challenge injustice and oppression when they saw it. So their opposition to the practice of sati in India, where the widow would throw herself on the funeral pyre of her husband, was first challenged by Christian missionaries. The seclusion of women and the lack of education for women was challenged by them. The provision of health was provided by them, and so on. You could multiply these examples. It is perhaps worth saying that whilst the missionaries had this very sacrificial commitment and ministry, they were not alone in this. Quite often what they did would not have been possible without Christians in the locality. And nor were the missionaries from the West the only ones, even then, who were crossing cultures. Just to give you some examples, Bishop Samuel Ajay Crowther, the first bishop in Nigeria, was from Sierra Leone. He was sent by CMS as a missionary to what is now Nigeria, and more or less established the mission there and therefore the church. Neither CMS nor its missionaries treated Crowther kindly because he worked in an African and not in an English way. So there was insensitivity also to people and their values and their cultures displayed. Maybe not by people in London, but certainly by many missionaries in the field. Bernard Mizeki, who went from Mozambique via South Africa to evangelize the Shona people of Zimbabwe. You see, there's so much to receive from Mozambique, as Bishop Richard was saying. He learned their language. He not only gave them the scriptures in their language, but he used their spiritual terminology to communicate the gospel to them. It's always a question in mission, how much of a people's spiritual and cultural terminology is the missionary to use? What is to be rejected and what is to be taken up? As we saw, this was also a question in the very earliest period of mission. Apollo Kivebulea, who went from Uganda to evangelize in the Congo. And Abdul Masih in India, the first Indian to be ordained in the Anglican Church, who'd been a Muslim imam, who became an Anglican priest and was responsible for taking the gospel to Muslim people in northern India and what is now Pakistan. Without these people, even that phase of missionary activity would not have been as fruitful as it was under God. At this time, certain principles were set out which I believe remain important for us. There were three great men. One was Henry Venn, who was my predecessor as the General Secretary of the Church Missionary Society, and I used assiduously to read his correspondence, which was probably as vast as Bishop Compton's. It's amazing how much correspondence these people engaged in. And it was Venn and coincidentally a Presbyterian at the same time in the United States, a man called Rufus Anderson, who developed this idea that the churches that were being planted should be self-governing, self-supporting, and self-propagating. It's quite interesting how the Chinese Communist government picked up the three self movement actually from these great missionary thinkers. But when he was asked, what would these churches that were being planted in this way have to do with the Church of England? He said that his hope was that they would have spiritual relations with the Church of England. And it is very interesting that the 1930 Lambeth Conference, when it came to articulate the kind of interdependence that there should be in the communion, used the terms in almost word for word that Venn had used 70, 80 years before then. And then Roland Allen, the other great missionary from a more Catholic tradition, but his point was that mission is not there to be perpetuated. Mission is for the sake of the church, and he was very hostile to missionary societies simply perpetuating their structures on the mission field. In his book, Missionary Methods, St. Paul's or Ours, he said that Paul did not plant missions, he planted churches. And I think we've always got to be aware of simply perpetuating what we like, what may become a hobby of ours, or whatever it may be. Now, all of these matters that both Venn and Roland Allen were writing about and talking about in the 19th century remain important for us today. What is the relationship between the proper self-governance, self-support, self-propagation, those tasks that every church has? What is the relation between that on the one hand and interdependence on the other, the spiritual relations that Venn was talking about? And many of the things that have happened in the Anglican communion in recent years show us that we've not got this right yet. And so we must continue to work at these questions. All of this was followed by the Edinburgh Missionary Conference of 1910. And you know that one of the calls of the Edinburgh Conference was the evangelization of the world in this generation. Talk about optimism. They really believed it. the evangelization of the world in this generation. Edinburgh 1910, although perhaps those who'd gathered there did not know this, was a great watershed because, first of all, it gave birth to the modern ecumenical movement. The realization that Christians must work together in mission because working in a way that was divided hinders mission. This was being felt in East Africa already with the Kikuyu conferences, in Asia, and in many other parts of the world. Bishop Azariah, the Bishop of Donegal, who was responsible on his own for the baptism of 500,000 people during his episcopate, I can't claim that. I mean, I've been a bishop now for quite a long time, but I could not claim 500,000. Anyway, Azariah was at Edinburgh, and in describing the sacrificial work of the missionaries from the West, he said, yes, they have given up everything for the gospel. They've given their bodies to be burned. But we need one more thing. He said, we need friends. Give us friends. And how important that is in the cause of Christian mission, that Christian mission cannot succeed without friendship. It cannot just be a method, it cannot just be study, it certainly cannot just be preaching at people, but it has to be relational. We are discovering this, of course, more and more today. The third thing about Edinburgh has to do with demography. When Edinburgh came together in 1910, there were 10 million Christians in sub-Saharan Africa. 10 million. How many are there now? 500 million? Well, that's nearly right, 400 million. 400 million. So maybe the evangelization of the world in this generation was ambitious, but from 10 million to 400 million is a big difference. And the same can be said about, for example, a country like Korea, where evangelization had barely begun at the time that Edinburgh met. I was driving around with a Korean pastor a few months ago, and he was shaking his head. He was saying, Bishop, secularism is very strong in Korea, and the Christian population has gone down from 35% to 30%. And I thought, well, what would we give for 30% in England? China, 3 million in 1949, at the time that Mr. Chen escaped, as we were hearing from John McArdle. Now, at a conservative estimate, 100 million. Now, the point about all of this is that demography affects mission. You see, this is not just a numbers game. I was asking Archbishop Oko of Nigeria how many Nigerians went to the Holy Land every year, and he said 20,000. 20,000 Nigerians go to the Holy Land every year. What is the missionary significance of that kind of peregrinus, if you like? Unimaginable 50 years ago or even 30 years ago. But it's happening now. Great movements of Christian people throughout the world. Last month I was in Iran, and the church is under tremendous pressure, and we need to pray for that church. But the active missionaries in Iran are the Korean technicians and engineers and health workers who are there to earn a living, but also who bring the gospel in that very difficult situation in a way that Western people simply could not do. The Chaldean Catholic Church in Iran uses Indian clergy, and the Anglican Church uses mostly Pakistani clergy. So South-South mission, because of these changes in demography, South-South mission is just becoming ordinary. When apartheid was ending in South Africa, The church in the province of Southern Africa became aware that there were other issues apart from racial justice that the church had to address. One of them was the multi-faith nature of South African society. And the bishop said to me at the time I was with CMS, they said, can you help us with this? Because we don't know how to begin. And so we arranged for people from the Church of North India to go to South Africa to help the church there with relationships with people of other faiths. There is also, of course, what you might call South-North mission, that is to say, the need of churches in the Western world to receive the enthusiasm and the sacrifice and the witness and the love of the Lord from Christians in other parts of the world. This is necessary for the sake of the flourishing of the gospel here in America, in the United Kingdom, and in other Western countries. But of course, the Lord continues also to call people from here to go elsewhere. I've just been with Pat, a deacon from the Diocese of Rochester, who has gone to work in the barrios of Lima. It's nothing short of apostolic ministry. I was standing with them in the middle of one of these barrios where the people literally live with the pigs. The smell, I mean, I don't remember too much about the barrier, but I do remember the smell. This kind of incarnational ministry, God is still calling people to fulfill. And indeed, there may be some here whom God is calling. Now, finally, therefore, for our time, as we recover, as we remember what has gone before, there's a glorious history of Christian mission going right back to the reorganizing of the Diocese of London. Let's put it like that. As we remember this glorious history before God and plead to Him for His assistance as we remember, what are we to do? What are the issues for today that we face? And very briefly, I just want to point to some. No doubt you will think of others. The first has to do with the need for the church vigorously to promote freedom of belief, of expression, of the need to manifest one's belief and to live by it throughout the world. So with the Arab Spring, for instance, that was so celebrated in the Western media, I never thought it was a spring, and it will prove not to be, as you will see. But in the whatever it was, in the context of that movement or series of movements, it became quite clear to me that democracy is never enough. I mean, it's repeated like a mantra by Western politicians and the press, but democracy could simply be a tyranny of the majority. It's no better for that. And it was clear to me in countries like Egypt, for instance, that what was also needed was a rule of law, a commitment to freedom, equality of citizenship, if the future of the large Christian community there was at all to be safeguarded and where we could have hope. And what I say of Egypt can also be said about other countries. But this commitment to freedom of belief, expression, of manifestation of belief is also relevant with the approaching, perhaps I should say encroaching, totalitarianism that we now see in the West. Reference was made to it earlier by Bishop Richard when I think he was speaking of the state pretending to be some kind of church. where aggressive secularism is making a society where disagreement with its governing ethos is not tolerated. Secularism, by the way, in history has always resulted in totalitarianism. There's not a single instance of secularism leading to freedom. Whether you look at the kind of National Socialist kind of secularism, or Stalin, or Mao Zedong in China, or Pol Pot, or even Saddam Hussein. I mean, the Ba'ath Party in Syria and Iraq was consciously modeled on European fascism of the 1920s and 30s. So is there going to be reasonable accommodation for Christians and others in terms of conscience, of belief, of expression of belief, or not? I mean, we are under tremendous pressure these days, whether it is from European laws that originate goodness knows where, or from British courts that interpret them in a certain way, in restricting the freedom of Christians to live according to their belief. And that may also be true of people of other beliefs. Secondly, as we face this worldwide mission of the Church, the question of how Christian faith is to relate to culture and to other faiths. You may call this the uniqueness of Jesus Christ sort of question. I've always felt that you can't talk about the uniqueness of Christ without at the same time and in the same breath also talking about his universality. But whatever you say, this is a question that will not go away. And so often, Christians who lose their nerve for mission lose their nerve because they do not believe that God has revealed himself uniquely in Jesus Christ and in the salvation that he brings for all people. And in a strange way, uniqueness and universality are related because they do not believe in his uniqueness, they also do not believe in his universal significance. And then, thirdly, what has this to do with the gospel in the Western world? And it seems to me that there are a number of things that should be pointed out. First of all, the need for a big story, a meta-narrative, will be necessary if the West is to be rescued from continual fragmentation, anxiety, and also trivia, if one may put it like that. I mean, how often do we read our politician speeches and say, well, what is there that gives us any reason for living? Hence, so much depression that there is around. There is a need for a big story. And the point about the Western world is that such a story cannot be achieved without reference to the Christian faith. There is no alternative. Aggressive secularism sometimes assumes values that stem from the Bible without being able to give a reason for them. But certainly it has not provided any kind of grand narrative that may undergird the lives of peoples and of nations. Now, in this context, it may be that some of these stories take a particular form. So the English story is not the same as the French. The conversion of Ethelbert and his court is quite distinct from the baptism of Clovis, for instance, or the cutting down of the oak in Germany, or the story of the spread of the Christian faith in Scandinavia. So there are particularities about the stories that are legitimate. But without them, I cannot see how a nation can have any sense of being a nation. In this sense, it is perhaps right to say that it is not so important what happens to the church, whether, for example, the Church of England remains established or not. Bishop Richard was pointing out how marginal all of this is already. But what is important is the Christian story, how the Judeo-Christian tradition of the Bible lies at the root of national life in Britain, sustains many of its institutions, and provides the way in which we can think morally for today and for tomorrow. I mean, that is its value. This is irrespective of whether there is an established church or not. Secondly, the Christian story provides what Peter Berger has called signals of transcendence. That is to say, if people are to look beyond their immediate circumstances, the daily grind, the common round, however you want to put it, what are the stories? From where will they come to take them out of themselves rather than to condemn them to the daily grind and the common round? If they will not come from the Bible, and what flows from the Bible. These signals of transcendence were particularly seen, of course, as we know, in the way in which the year was structured. So there were times when people were taken out of themselves. We are just coming out of the Christmas cycle, the period of Epiphany and beyond. Then there's Easter, then there's Pentecost, and so on. Holy days that made people understand their situation and also pointed them to what was beyond their situation. And now holy days have become holidays. That is what secularization has done to these signals of transcendence. And then, thirdly, of course, the Christian story is needed for living responsibly, living for other people, turning away from greed and the dogma of self-fulfillment, of having a regard for the poor, the moral resources that we need day by day to live, not only individually but as communities. Prime Minister David Cameron has been talking about the big society. Well, where are the moral resources for the big society to come from? His advisor, Philip Blond, who perhaps is responsible for this idea in the first place, sees quite clearly that they must come from the Christian tradition. But does his boss see it like that? That's the question. So yes, there has been a losing of the way. There's been amnesia, not just once, but from time to time, and maybe we are coming out of that period now, the latest sort of bout of amnesia. But the Bible tells us that anamnesis is also possible. Remembering who we are, remembering what God has done for us and with us and through us, and reminding God of His many mercies so that we can go forward with hope and with confidence into the future. Thank you very much indeed.